federal drug trafficking charges, a flight halfway around the world, and an arrest that brought a Parma, Ohio man back to face the case he allegedly ran from. According to reporting from Cleveland 19 News, the Justice Department says the man fled to Thailand in what prosecutors call an attempt to dodge federal drug trafficking charges. How do you catch someone who's already crossed an ocean to disappear? That's actually what this case answers. And it says something about how small the world has gotten for federal fugitives. Here's where this story is going. We'll walk through what's publicly known about this case, the original charges, the decision to run, and how authorities closed the distance between a mid-size Ohio suburb and a country on the other side of the planet. We'll also be upfront about what isn't public yet, because a case like this generates a lot of assumption online, and assumption isn't fact. Everything here is sourced. Everything alleged against this man is exactly that. Alleged, until a court says otherwise. Let's start with what's actually been reported. A man from Parma, Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland, was arrested after fleeing to Thailand, according to Cleveland 19 News. The Justice Department says leaving the country was an attempt to evade federal drug trafficking charges already filed against him. The reporting doesn't specify the exact substances involved, the scale of the alleged trafficking, or whether other people are named as co-defendants. What's confirmed is the sequence. Federal charges came first, his departure from the United States followed, and Thailand is where he was located and taken into custody before being returned to face the case in the U.S. court system. I went through how these Justice Department fugitive announcements are usually worded, and one thing stood out about this one. It's unusually thin on the specifics federal drug cases normally lead with. No dollar figures. No mention of a specific network or quantity. Cases like this, when law enforcement is being careful about an active or newly returned prosecution, sometimes stay vague on purpose while things move through arraignment. So what does a federal drug trafficking charge actually mean? That phrase gets thrown around a lot without much explanation. Generally speaking, and this is context about how these cases work, not a claim about the specific facts of this one, federal drug trafficking charges are typically brought under statutes covering the manufacture, distribution, or possession with intent to distribute controlled substances. What separates a federal case from a state one is usually scale, interstate movement, or the involvement of a federal task force in the original investigation. Federal drug cases are prosecuted by U.S. attorneys' offices, and a conviction on trafficking charges can carry mandatory minimum sentences depending on the substance and quantity involved under federal sentencing guidelines. None of that tells us the specifics of this defendant's case. It's just the backdrop that explains why the stakes were apparently high enough that, according to the Justice Department, he chose to leave the country rather than face the charges here. Fleeing the country after being charged is its own decision, with its own consequences, and it's worth looking at how that plays out for federal law enforcement. When someone with active federal charges leaves the United States, the case doesn't disappear. Prosecutors can and often do pursue what's sometimes informally called fugitive status. The charges stay on the books, an arrest warrant stays active, and coordination begins with agencies whose job is specifically to locate people who've crossed a border to avoid prosecution. That can involve the U.S. Marshals Service, which runs dedicated fugitive task forces, sometimes alongside Interpol notices that flag a wanted individual to law enforcement in other countries. This is standard practice for federal fugitive cases broadly, not a specific claim about which agencies handled this particular investigation, since that detail hasn't been reported. Here's an obstacle that comes up constantly in cases like this, whether or not it applied here: distance and jurisdiction. Once a person leaves U.S. soil, American law enforcement can't just walk in and make an arrest. They depend on cooperation from a foreign government, on treaties negotiated years or decades earlier, and on local law enforcement having both the willingness and the resources to act on a U.S. request. That's not a small hurdle. Countries vary enormously in how quickly they respond to American extradition and location requests, and even with a treaty in place, verifying someone's identity, confirming their location, and coordinating a lawful arrest can take months. In this case, based on what's been reported, the process worked. He was found in Thailand and brought back. But how long it took and who exactly coordinated it are details that haven't been made public yet. Most people assume that once you've left the country, you're effectively untouchable unless you did something spectacular to get noticed. Cases like this tell a different story. The tools available to federal law enforcement for tracking someone internationally have expanded a lot over the past 2 decades. Financial monitoring, travel record sharing between allied nations, biometric data at border crossings, and long-standing law enforcement liaison relationships most people never hear about unless a case like this surfaces. Thailand, for context, has an extradition relationship with the United States going back generations, and it's a country that receives a lot of American travelers and expatriates every year, which also means its immigration and law enforcement systems have experience working with U.S. authorities on exactly this kind of case, so the broader mechanics make sense. A charge was filed, a man allegedly ran, and the systems built for exactly this scenario eventually caught up with him. That's the shape of the story the Justice Department is telling. What's still missing is the texture, the actual timeline of his time in Thailand, how he was identified, and what specifically pushed this case from federal fugitive to in custody. Those pieces usually come out during arraignment and in follow-up reporting, and they're worth watching for. Let's talk about what we don't know, because it matters just as much as what we do. The original reporting doesn't say how long he was in Thailand before he was located. It doesn't say whether he was traveling under his own name, whether he had help, or whether Thai authorities flagged him first or U.S. agencies tracked him there directly. It doesn't name a specific city or region in Thailand where the arrest happened. And it doesn't detail the substance, the quantity, or the dollar value tied to the original trafficking charges, details that in most federal drug cases tend to surface once an indictment becomes public record. Until those details are confirmed by primary sources, we're not going to guess at them, because guessing is exactly what turns a factual case into a rumor. Here's the part that doesn't quite add up on the surface. How does a case generate a national headline, "Man fled to Thailand to avoid drug charges," without any of the underlying specifics made public? The honest answer is timing. Cases freshly returned to U.S. custody, especially ones involving an international arrest, often stay procedurally quiet in the earliest days. Prosecutors are frequently cautious about what they release before an arraignment, partly to avoid tainting a jury pool and partly because plea negotiations or additional charges can still be in motion. That's not unique to this case. It's a pattern across a lot of federal drug cases that start with international arrests, and it usually sorts itself out within the following weeks as court filings become public. What stands out about this case is less the man at the center of it and more what it says about the system around him. A federal drug charge followed him across an ocean. That's worth sitting with for a second. There was a time, not that long ago, when fleeing overseas was an effective way to disappear from an American legal case. Passports weren't cross-checked in real time, financial trails went cold at the border, and international law enforcement cooperation moved at the speed of paperwork, not data. That world doesn't really exist anymore for most destinations, and this case is one more data point suggesting the calculation, "I can just leave and it'll go away," has gotten a lot riskier than it used to be. And here's a take that'll probably get us some pushback. Fleeing the country after being charged, instead of fighting the case through the court system, tends to make things worse for a defendant, not better. It's an unpopular thing to say, because on the surface, running feels like the only move available to someone facing serious federal time. But practically, flight can be used by prosecutors as evidence of consciousness of guilt. It can affect bail and detention decisions once someone is back in custody, and depending on how it's charged, fleeing prosecution can carry its own separate federal exposure on top of the original charges. None of that is a statement about guilt or innocence on the underlying drug trafficking allegations. That's still very much for a court to decide. It's just an observation about strategy, and in most federal cases we've looked at, running rarely works out the way people hope. So where does this actually leave him? Based on what's public, he's now back in the United States, facing the federal drug trafficking charges filed against him before he left. Those charges are, again, allegations. He hasn't been convicted of anything related to this case, and under the American legal system, he's presumed innocent unless and until the government proves its case beyond a reasonable doubt in front of a court. That's not a formality we're adding for legal cover. It's the actual standard that applies, and it applies just as much to a case with a dramatic international arrest as it does to any other. What do you think? Does a decision to flee the country change how you view a case like this, even before you know the underlying facts? Or should the flight itself be treated separately from the question of guilt on the original charges? That's a genuinely open question, worth sitting with rather than answering reflexively. There's a line in most Justice Department fugitive announcements that reads almost like an afterthought, and this case has it too. A quiet reference to interagency cooperation most readers skim right past. That's usually where the real story is. Behind a headline like this one, there's typically a coordination chain most people never see. Whoever first flagged the travel, whoever confirmed identity on the ground, whoever handled the legal handoff back to US custody. That process, in cases involving Thailand specifically, generally moves through established law enforcement liaison channels rather than anything resembling a dramatic on-the-ground chase. It's slower, more bureaucratic, and far less cinematic than people imagine, and that's exactly why it works as consistently as it does. Put yourself in the position of a federal prosecutor watching a defendant's location go dark right after charges are filed. You don't get a dramatic chase. You get a case file, a warrant, and a waiting game that can stretch on for months while other agencies narrow down where someone actually is. That's the unglamorous reality behind almost every one of these fled overseas, later arrested cases, and it's worth remembering the next time a headline like this shows up with no other details attached. There's a lot of quiet, procedural work sitting underneath it. So where does the story go from here? He's back in US custody. The federal drug trafficking charges are active, and the next real milestone in a case like this is typically arraignment, where additional details from the indictment usually become public record for the first time. That's also usually when we learn whether the flight itself resulted in additional charges, and whether prosecutors intend to argue for detention without bail given the international flight risk his history now demonstrates. We should say clearly, we don't know how this case resolves, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. What we can tell you is what a case like this typically involves once it reaches this stage, based on how federal drug trafficking prosecutions generally proceed. Pretrial detention hearings where the government will likely cite his prior flight as reason to hold him without bail, a period of discovery where both sides review the evidence, and eventually either a plea agreement or a trial. Federal drug trafficking cases in the U.S. resolve via plea agreement far more often than they go to trial. That's a well-documented pattern across federal prosecutions broadly, not a prediction about this specific case. We cut a few of the more technical legal details from this video for length, the specific mechanics of how fugitive flight can factor into federal sentencing guidelines, for instance. If you want that broken down in a follow-up video, drop a comment and let us know. For now, here's the honest summary. A man from Parma, Ohio, was federally charged with drug trafficking. According to the Justice Department, he left the country rather than face those charges and ended up in Thailand. He was located and arrested there and has since been returned to the United States to face the original case. Nothing beyond that has been independently confirmed in the reporting available right now. Not the substances involved, not a dollar figure, not a specific date for either the original charges or the arrest overseas, and not the names of any additional people who might be connected to the underlying trafficking allegations. That gap is worth respecting rather than filling in with speculation. Court records, once they're publicly filed and accessible, will eventually answer most of the questions this case still leaves open. Until then, the responsible thing to do is describe exactly what's known, attribute it to where it came from, and hold off on anything that isn't confirmed. If you want to follow this story as more becomes public, the Justice Department's press release page and the relevant U.S. Attorney's Office typically post updates once a case like this reaches arraignment. We'll keep an eye on it. And if federal fugitive cases like this interest you, the ones where the arrest doesn't happen at the scene, but months or years later, on the other side of the world, that's a pattern we cover often, so there's more of this if you're looking for it.